To go. So we're going to get started. You're very welcome, everyone, to this evening, the next edition of our county leadership webinars. So this is on fixture planning and competition guidelines. Lynn Savage, National Development Manager, and obviously joined with Paula Prunty here tonight. So you're stuck with the two of us for the night. But we're going to keep interacting in and out. And I know we were just discussing there the last time we were liaising about fixtures was when after the first lockdown of COVID, and we were discussing how we were going to get things back up and running. So we know a few people will have touched on some of this before, but we have mixed it up a little bit, obviously, to make it more applicable for the year ahead. So hopefully we'll have covered most things. What we are going to stress to you is tonight's not about the national fixture plan has not been agreed yet. So we're going to outline that from the start, and you have all the counties have been told from Central Council that will be going out ASAP. Obviously then the provincial fixtures is going into it, but tonight's about giving you the tools that when you have that, hopefully in the next few weeks, you can start filtering your own into it. So it's really just to get you thinking about it. There's no ideal fixture plan because every county is different numbers of teams, different age grades, etc. So all we can do is give you the tools, which we're hoping to do tonight. So if you want to ask a question, feel free to throw it in the Q&A as we go through it. We'll also engage you with some polls and some chat function throughout it, so feel free to do that. And if you can't hear at any stage, then you can leave the webinar and come back in, no problem at all. So the Q&A function and the chat is the big ones that we'll be looking for tonight. So we're going to get started straight away with a little bit of interaction. We've a mixture of people obviously logged in. So Paula's going to launch a poll now in a second, and it's going to ask, have you been involved in fixture planning in your county before? Just so we can see a mixture of who has and who hasn't. So Paul, I don't know if you want to launch the poll there to see. So just click yes if you have, and no if you haven't. Okay. So we have 82% who are saying yes they have, and 18 that no they haven't. So that's great. It's a good mixture, and for people who have, you're still going to pick up tools from it. From people who haven't, hopefully you learn from scratch, which is great as well, and help you build it into your county for the coming year. So we'll get kick-started straight away. This quote is going to start us particularly in the times that we're in with COVID, in that you can plan the perfect picnic, but you can't predict the weather. So in other words, I know even from a development perspective, we've been looking at plans for next year, and we can have the perfect plan that we can see, but none of us can predict what is going to happen, particularly in 2021. People are talking about different peaks coming again in COVID. We hope we don't have it. We hope we have vaccines. But what we're saying is it is important. You're better having a plan and having to change it than having no plan at all. So really, that's what this quote's about. It's putting the ideal plan that you can have, but there will be different weathers, different storms that you're going to have to go against in the year ahead. But hopefully with the plans that we have and the competition guidelines that we give you, it should make that stormy weather a hell of a lot easier. So for fixture planning, as we mentioned at the start, you have national fixtures, provincial fixtures, and then you have your county fixtures, which obviously involves all your clubs. So the reason, I suppose, Central Council and management had been looking at updating the master fixtures was there was suggestions there to create a club window or club windows for 2021. Now, what is important to outline in that is that just means maybe potentially for club championships. So it's not to say that there's no other adult or club competition can take place outside of those windows. There's loads of other ones. There's your non-county player leagues, etc., cup matches. So all of that. So it is important when you're looking at your fixture planning. If it happens to be that there's club windows agreed, that doesn't mean all your fixtures have to fit into that window. Remember all the other times where counties are playing, we have other players on your teams. That's important to include in them. So when we started on these and we asked what was the current issues in counties regarding fixtures and what was the possible solutions, a lot of the stuff that came up was around this, and I've put pre-COVID because if we keep COVID in it, we'll have about another page to add into it of all the things. But we're trying to think next year, hopefully we won't have as much bother as we had this year. But some of the things that was coming up was not enough games being provided for players, and by that we need to remember it's not by team, it's by player. So some players only play with one team. If they're not perhaps one of the stronger players, they may not be on multiple teams. Too much or little time between fixtures. too short a time period for fixtures, so maybe just all playing in 1 month or 2 months, and then there's nothing for that age group for the rest of the year. Fixtures not being set until short time scale before they're due to take place. Too many fixtures not taking place on their scheduled date or for failing to fulfil, and this can be really frustrating for county boards, where you spend so much time preparing your fixtures and then a team won't play, or there's a wedding and there's a communion and there's a birthday party and there's everything else. So this is where your competition guidelines are going to be really important to get those fixtures played on their scheduled dates. County board meetings taken over by fixtures discussions, and I know both Paul and myself have been in a number of meetings over the past few years, and at times you wouldn't call them county board meetings. I'd actually call them fixtures meetings, because the only discussion was fixtures, whereas that shouldn't be at a county board meeting. Apart from 1 or 2 decisions that has to be made, there's a fixtures committee and a terms of reference for them for a reason, and it's to allow them to sort out the fixtures problems. No competition guidelines in place has been an issue as well, so there has been no way of stopping teams not fulfilling fixtures, etc., because there was no competition guidelines there. Dual player clash, and I know that came up in some of the fixtures as well, or the questions as well. How do we deal with it? So we've a few things on that as well. And county managers dictating fixtures, and I know in some of the proposals that came in for the massive fixture plan, there was actually time scales put in as to when county managers could play challenge games, for instance, and how many a week. So I don't know exactly what's going to come out of that master fixture plan, but there's plenty of the topics you've discussed have been submitted in various proposals. Some of the additional issues that we've seen now with COVID, or potentially for 2021, the questions that counties are throwing at us: what happens if we have further restrictions or lockdowns? And this is important for you as a county to think about, because, for instance, if you have fixtures scheduled for May and there's a lockdown in May, as I said, we're hoping we're not going to see any of them, but just in case, if you decide you're going to have to try and squeeze them in somewhere else, does it squeeze something else out? Or do you need to make a decision that, okay, if there's a lockdown at any particular time, the fixtures that were due to happen at that time are gone, so that we're not squeezing something else out? So I'm not saying either way is right, but it's important that you have a decision on that at the start of the year, so that you know what's going to happen if it does happen. How can we minimise travel? So some of the counties have talked about, I don't want having Club A having to travel to Club B because of the opposite end. So how do we need to construct competitions? And hopefully after 2021 will be the last time we'll have to look at some of this stuff, but it may be there particularly for the start of 2021. Short of referees is not comfortable officiating during COVID, so that again has been feedback from some of the counties. And will all clubs want to participate? So in some cases there was clubs who were saying, or a particular team, that they didn't feel comfortable to participate, but you'll know a lot of that from when they register at the start of the year and say which competitions they want to be involved in. But these are just a few additional ones that, never mind pre-COVID, these have thrown themselves on top of us now as well. So what we're trying to say by the end of this is that if we can get our planning right, if we can put clear guidelines, we'll get as close to success as possible. Taking on board what we said in that slide previous about the perfect plan, and we can't predict the weather, but as close as possible, we will get success. But without these two, it's going to be mayhem for the year. So that's where we want to focus, on these two areas. So before we start, and we always say this when we're talking about fixtures, it is so important that you don't take it team by team. It has to be looked at the age grade. So for instance, there with your under 14s, if we pretend their player numbers at the bottom, and these are just examples. So 12 of them might be under 14 only. So in other words, that's the only team they get to play with. But 8 of them get to play under 16 also. But remember, that's fine. They might have extra games at under 14 and 16. But there's 12 of them there that is only under 14. So if you fit all their fixtures into one small window, they might only get 6-8 weeks of fixtures. So it's remembering that we have to spread them out. The same with the under 16s. Maybe 6 of them are under 16 only. So what you find is players who maybe are better players or perceived better players, we're talking about them playing multiple fixtures. But people talk about burnout. There's actually the complete opposite to burnout for these players who are stale nearly. They're not getting enough games. And that's what people play for. They want games. So we need to be very careful on that. In that case, maybe 8 of them are those under 14s that came up. 10 of them are under 18 also, which is fine. The same with the under 18s. They might have 7 who are under 18 only. So how do we make sure they're getting enough games? 10 who are under 16, 18, 5 who are adult also, and the same then moving on to adult. And this is important to look at, and I know you won't know this for every team. What we're trying to say is to remember not every player plays in more than one team. And I know things have changed a lot over the last few years in many counties, and that's great, so well done to you. Because we used to see things like the minor, which we're saying is the dropout age, being shoehorned into the end of the year with maybe a knockout championship of 2 games. So for those players who were only minor, that might be all they got for the year because they weren't on multiple teams. And it's okay saying, oh, but sure, they're more than likely in the adult teams. There's quite a lot that's not. So we just have to make sure we're getting enough games for all the age grades is really, really important. So what's the key ingredients of putting your fixtures together? So there's 4 steps. Planning, which is your well thought out plan through feedback from all parties involved. Then you're going to schedule them, and I'm going to go into this in a second. So what's the time of the year for all the fixtures? Arranging them, which is the nitty gritty details. And then the big thing, to make sure we review them at the end of every year, because we can only improve things if we review them. And it is important to review them in some way with your club. So whether that be a meeting or a survey or whatever, just to get some feedback as to how things went. So planning is designing each competition. So what's the number of teams? What's the structure? The number of rounds? Where will the competition be placed? Which days of the week? So all those things in order to achieve the minimum standards. And we're going to mention minimum standards in a second. And also we can help to check the registration. So what suits your county? Because you'll see by the numbers that's coming up from different clubs to see what will suit your county. For scheduling then, it means placing all the fixtures onto a calendar. And we'll show an example of this, which will be published prior to the beginning of the playing season, so everybody can see when their fixtures are going to happen. And yes, give or take, there may be a few changes. Arranging is getting really the nitty gritty. So we know it's over a certain weekend, but now we want to know what's the date, what's the time, what's the venue, who's the referee. So that's the arranging, the nitty gritty. And this is where it's really important to have the competition guidelines in place to ensure the fixtures are played when they're scheduled, because that's where it gets frustrating for you as a county board. If fixtures keep getting moved left, right and centre. And then the reviewing, as we said, is collecting all the information on the games being played during a season and comparing it with, okay, so this is what we planned, but actually what happened. So we can compare the schedules and the recommended standards. And all of this then can be incorporated into your planning process for the following year. So maybe you ran a competition at a certain time of the year and it didn't work. So that's fine, we tried it. So now we're going to learn from it and we bring it into the planning process for the following year. The minimum standards that we mentioned there, these were the minimum standards recommended by Central Council. I know during this year we had said in many cases these would lower because obviously we had half a year nearly that we didn't get any football, but hopefully going forward we'll get back to some sort of normality. So for adult, the minimum was 16 games. Now that's all competitions. So that's where I'm saying it's important that, okay, if we have a club window that there's club championship and maybe part of the league, that's not going to get all those games for all of those club players. So that's where it's important to have other competitions, other cups and everything else to allow them to play. Under 15 to 18, a minimum of 12 games, and under 14 and below, a minimum of 16 games. So again, it's remembering that this is every player. This isn't the team. This is the player as such. So it's not that that club had that amount of fixtures. It's trying to make sure that if I'm St. Patrick's under 14 team, that we have 16 games we could potentially play in this year. So that's the recommended. I know it's not always possible, but as close to that as possible is what people should be aiming for. On the other minimum standards, games should be scheduled with gaps of no more than 21 days between them in the months of April to September in order to maximise the number of games played during the summer months. And obviously that might change slightly time-wise, depending on the fixture plans also, and that exception around exam time. But the reason no more than 21 days that if a player, particularly a young player, if they play, that they're not waiting 6 to 8 weeks before they play their next game. So it's to give them games, and as I said, it doesn't necessarily always have to be the next championship game or the next league game, some sort of competition that's there for them. And games in the same grade should be scheduled at least 5 days apart, 3 days in non-championship to avoid surplus of games. So, okay, we forgot to fit in the minor, as I said, or that minor that in traditional times used to get shoehorned into the end of the year, and all of a sudden there was teams playing on a Sunday and a Wednesday and a Sunday again, having not played for the rest of the year. So how do we make sure that's spread? And again, we'll show that on some calendars coming up. The schedule and target. So the target for counties should be to ensure 80% of games are played as initially scheduled. So yes, of course, there's going to be a little bit of a game might have to be cancelled for some reason or moved for some reason. So that's why it's 80%. It's not 100. So that's on the day they were originally fixed for, or within a number of days. So some competition guidelines might be it has to be played on or before 2 o'clock on the Sunday. So it might be or within 2 days. So that's still counted as on target, but that's only if that target was in your competition guidelines. So you'll define what your competition guidelines are. So just to make sure everyone's there for a second before we go on to the next part of that, can you list in the chat there for Paula, and she'll give some feedback on it, some of the types of competitions in your county, just so we can get a bit of feedback of what some of the types of competitions.
They're all very quiet for you tonight, Lynn. You must be explaining it very well. There's not a lot of, no questions for you. Okay, so some people have put in league, championship, sevens, competitions.
Perfect.
League.
Yeah. Any more?
They're all still typing.
They'll all come at you at once now, Paul.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, league, championship seems to be the most common one. 9-a-side.
Yeah, excellent. 9-a-side used to be one of my own favourites.
Some have championship, leagues, shields, plate games.
Brilliant.
But the majority, the structures seem to be championship and league. Some of under 12, non-competitive, under 14, 16 minor, adult, then the junior, intermediate and senior league and championship. They have league and championship in every grade plus non-league, non-county league. They have some have reserve league, some have championship blitzes from under 8 up to senior.
Brilliant. So there's absolutely loads coming in there. So it's good. It's good to see that. And as you said, Paula, probably the core ones of the league and championship you'll see in a lot of counties, and then the reserve leagues and the 9-a-sides and a lot of those other ones are what's brought in maybe to supplement them, which is really good. So I think you've named everything that was put in there: the leagues, the cups, the championships, the 7, the 9, the 11-a-side, the Go Games, winter, spring leagues, participation leagues, non-county player competitions, festivals of games, and there's more. So I think you've named a lot of them. As I said, I know myself, and it's not today or yesterday, I was playing county football, but there was a 9-a-side league in our own county, and I know as a county player, we were jealous because we couldn't play in it. Because they really loved it, and they had the finals at the main grounds and everything else. So it was great for those players who weren't playing county football. So it's great you've listed so many there that are not necessarily for the county players as well. And yet it's still important that for the main competitions, the county player loves their club. So they're getting back in that as well. But it's just important when we talk there about the schedule and the arranging, the planning, that we're taking into account all the different competition types that potentially you have to plan for the different age groups. So that's where that's really important, to have a think about your competition types, and particularly, as we said, in the non-club window, if there is club windows, in the master fixture plan. So you're tracking the players rather than the teams, and Go Games was mentioned there as well, the non-competitive. So just really to clarify, that rule is in our rule book. So games in under 11 and younger are organised in the Go Games model. So they must be organised in the Go Games model, because trust me, we still do see, and we will be liaising with counties where we do see it, where we see a cup or whatever appearing in under 10 or under 11. It cannot happen. So this is the only rules that can happen, or only games that can happen from under 11 and younger. So you can see there is the rule in the rule book, so I'll leave it for you to read. And at under 12 level, competitions may be organised on a league format, and that's the only format, on the basis that participating teams should be a maximum of 13 aside. So that's the only way that competitions can be organised for under 11 and under 12. And also to remember, the county board does not have to organise all the Go Games blitzes, but I know a lot of counties cluster clubs together, and then the host club would actually organise it. So there's loads of ways of making sure there's loads of games for these underage players. And I do know Go Games is going to be relaunched in 2021 with all 3 codes working, so the GA, ourselves and Camogie. So there will be a big push on getting Go Games out there, because it's where kids develop the love of the game. and it's so important that we adhere to that. There's loads of samples of the Go Games rules, and you can adopt these for your county on our website, so feel free to go through them for all the different age groups. It'll help you out, and obviously you can make little tweaks and changes, but the big thing is that they must be by rule, which is listed there in the official guide. So when you're doing your planning, which we mentioned, there's a few priorities you need to take into account, and this is what we're going to try and help you in relation to how, okay, when I'm sitting with a blank piece of paper, where do I start? So the first thing you need to look at is insert the championship competitions first in your calendar, because I'm sure we'll all agree the championship is the big one for us all. Even from a county board, it's your penultimate thing. It's where you showcase the sport in your county. So you're putting in your championship competitions first. Where do you want them to happen? You want to try and make sure that you're not planning fixtures and blocks, and this will make more sense in the next slide. But for instance, no under 18 being played until all the under 14 is played, and then no under 16 played till all the under 14s played. It's trying to mix the grades up, because again, going back to that, remember not every player has more than one team. So if they're just playing over a 6-week period, well, that could be the only football though that a number of those girls get for the year, which then we wonder why they drop out. So we want to make sure that they're getting plenty of football throughout the year. And if it's a dual county, this is where it's really important to discuss at this stage in relation to the ages or competitions, at possible alternative periods or alternative days. And the reason it's put in there is this is county specific, so it is up to your county board to speak to the camogie board, and vice versa, because I know there's a few boards would get frustrated vice versa also, but there's no ingredient that we can give you that's going to fix that. You need to communicate, is the only way that that's going to fix. And sometimes we can be the bigger people and put a hand out and say, okay, we want to communicate on this, but that's the only way the dual player can work between the different codes, is through communication. And we'll touch on that a little bit more in a second. Some of the potential barriers when you're putting your plans in place: access to pitches. Obviously you don't have definite times and dates and everything else in relation to pitches, so that can be a barrier. Availability of referees can be a barrier, particularly if we've seen this year, it'll probably never be as busy again for referees, because all club fixtures were happening together when COVID, when the lockdown ended. So they were literally out constantly, but it was everybody pulling up the same referees. So how do we plan for that? And it might not be that you're going to be able to have 10 new adult referees next year, but you need to start planning now to have 10 in 4 or 5 years if the games are going to keep getting bigger. So we have a slide on that in a second too. Club not able to play on a date, and we'll come up on that one. Further restrictions could be a potential barrier. A potential barrier certainly for the start of 2021 is going to be, like, I cannot see where it's going to be possible to play blitzes or events with multiple teams at one venue. We all know Christmas, they're going to try and let things open a little bit more, but with that is highly likely going to come a little bit of a peak, which means that we're not going to be allowed to bring multiple teams together. But that doesn't mean, instead of a venue where we used to have 20 teams coming for a massive blitz, could we split them into 5 host clubs hosting 4 teams? So we can still get football for these girls, but we just need to think a little bit differently as to how we're doing things. Managers organising challenge games, and again, if that comes in the guide or the fixture plan as to when that can happen, it'll make it a lot easier. But obviously your club competitions are really important. 100% of players are in the club, and that's really important to remember. And the county fixtures, and I said that's where it is important that the plans are getting out as soon as possible to everybody involved. So the steps when you're sitting with your fixtures committee: assessing the number of dates required for each competition, prioritising your championships, look at the calendar, and remember you can use non-club windows for all other club competitions. Then you'll start to add in the provincial and national fixtures, which will be confirmed in the coming weeks, so at least you can see a clearer picture of where everything is. Prioritise the core age grade. So in your county, that could be Go Games under 14, 16, 18 adult. I know in some counties there might be under 15s, there might be under 17s. That's fine as well, then you'll fit them in, but the core age grades tend to be the core ones for counties, because they have county teams at those age grades. But fitting in your core age grades first, and then you can fit in the in-between age grades. Insert the most important competitions working back from the final date. So when would you like your final to be? How many weeks then between the finals and the semi-finals, for instance? So you fit them in. because all of a sudden then you start to see where things can start fitting in outside of that, and you'll see that in a little diagram coming up. Then insert all the other competitions, ensuring they are spread to allow football for players of all ages throughout the season. So trying to keep them all involved at different periods of the season. And again, remembering that, again, I know we keep going on about it, but it has been feedback from so many players who have dropped out of our sport. Would they wear that player who wasn't on multiple teams and only ended up, maybe they weren't even a great player, so they weren't even getting playing on the team that was their age grade for many of them. So yes, they might have only got a handful of games, and then for those handful, they weren't even getting playing because there were only championship games or there were only league games. So that's what we're saying, it's so important. If we want to really increase participation, then we get loads of games for every age. A sample here, and if you look at this sample, this is where we're talking about the blocks. And this does happen in a number of places. So these aren't just plucked out of the sky, where perhaps, okay, we're going to play all the under 14. So you can see there's only under 14 happening an adult, nothing else. Because we're just going to get those blocks. And then when the under 14's finished, then we'll move on to the under 16, and there'll be no under 14. So you can see in this case, for those players who are just under 14, for instance, they could be finished after 3-4 weeks or whatever amount of weeks that it is that you have the competitions done. And obviously your go games, etc., can go in there, no problem at all. We just threw in a line there in relation to the clubs can help you organise these as well, and it's up to yourself whichever way you work that. So that's just showing blocks. If you look at this one, okay, so the under 14s are still in there as they were, but in this one there's also maybe under 16s thrown in, and these are just examples, because obviously it'll depend on the number of days, and we do know at club level there is a number of players who will play across teams. You might say there's no way we could play under 14, 16, 18 in the 1 week, because a lot of our clubs are rural clubs and they'd have multiple players going across these, and that's fine. So that's an ideal scenario. But maybe it's something even like this that we could look at, where, okay, we have under 14 and we have under 16. There's still 5 days there between them. The under 18 teams don't play till the in between weeks. So that way, okay, girls might have 2 games in a week, but they love playing games. And that's what we have to remember, because if they're not playing games in those dates, they're going to be probably running the legs themselves more in a training session, whereas they actually want to play the games. So it's how do we spread this out so that there's players not left with no football for long periods of the year, which is a real important thing to try and look at when we're looking at our scheduling. This one is very small, don't worry, but it's just to show you, if you have an overall master sheet where you can clearly see where, and ignore the dates because they're just randomly put in. Maybe you have your senior county team, you might have provincial games, national games, you have your adult fixtures, then your underage county teams, then your in-between age groups, just so you can see a full view of when everyone will be involved. Because all of a sudden, if you can clearly see a gap with certain age grades, well, then you're going, geez, those players are getting nothing during that whole time. So if they can clearly see it, whereas if you can look and see, no, there's a maximum of maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks max between different things where they're getting games, they're constantly going to be engaged, and going training won't feel like a chore because of no upcoming games. So doing a little master plan for yourself so you can see all the age grades can really help you when you start filling in that calendar as to where you're actually going to put it, and you can see a clear picture of everything that's actually happening. And you can see there, even say when the National League's happening, one of the counties mentioned there were Paul of the 9-a-sides and the reserve leagues. We're getting loads of football in there, and what happens is they're all ready then when the championship kicks in with your county players who've played multiple games as well. If you plan them, it should ensure there's enough games being provided for players at all age grades. There's not too much or too little time between fixtures, so we're not saying, listen, we're only sending out the under 14 fixtures to you at the minute. When they're done, we'll then move on with the under 16s. Because also you have to think of the families who, okay, at the minute we can't go on holidays anywhere, but that may change, so that we're able to actually see, well, it's okay to go during that period or that period, because that's not when the fixtures are going to happen from the start of the year. And particularly for young girls, you know, it's devastating if they feel they're going to miss a big game, but maybe the family's paid a fortune for a holiday to put in for wherever that they're actually going to go. There's not too short a time period for fixtures, so that they're not in those short blocks. Fixtures are set in advance, as we said, so the clubs will know what's happening. And then fixtures take place on the scheduled date, and they still won't take place on the scheduled date if you don't have clear competition guidelines, which we're going to touch on next. But that's what's really going to make that they stick in place, that there's only the 1 or 2 days wriggle room, unless you as a county have to move it for a certain reason. So that's what planning should ensure, and people really buy into what you're trying to do. And I know even a number of counties we worked with over the past few years, that was the big thing of feedback maybe at the start from players, and by the end they were loving it, because they knew when the games were happening, they were getting loads of them, as much as possible at all different variations. So these are 3 scenarios, and we're not going to ask you to type in, but there's things that you need to think about yourself potentially that might happen. So we have a fixture plan agreed at the start of the year, and a week before the first championship game, a club requests a change of date due to a wedding. What can help us in this situation, and what would be the result? So we're about to talk about competition guidelines, but if you're currently sitting in your county and you don't have them, this could send your whole competition up the left, because it can be very hard for you to refuse maybe a player getting married and they hadn't notified you in advance that you could have fixed your fixtures round. But also without guidelines, where do you fall? When do you make the club play? So we're going to touch on that in a second. Scenario 2, we realise we have 20 games taking place next weekend, but we don't have enough referees. What should we have done earlier in the year to try and prevent this? So again, if you have your fixture plan, you can clearly see the busy weekends. And I know even for us, and I'm sure Paula will agree on this, there's a few weekends there where there were so many fixtures, there's a bit of panic to make sure there's enough referees in relation to it. But by preventing it earlier, so we know there's going to be weekends, and we know we have X amount of go games, we have X amount under 14. Really from now till February, March, getting as many referees courses as possible, for instance, to get clubs to get referees in. And as I said, yes, you might only pick up a handful of adult referees between now and next year, but those ones that you're training up underneath that will become adult referees if they're nurtured. And the tide is turning. There's a lot. Even recently, we had a college course where it was put out for referees, and 22 females actually come back looking for it. So the tide is turning. There is people wanting to do it, but we need to think about these things in advance. Scenario 3. We do not want a repeat of the semi-final where we had issues with the mentors of Team A as they'd taken over the sideline. What can we put in place to prevent this? So again, we need to make sure our competition guidelines are really there and in place, that make sure the teams know that it's not just come the final that we're going to adhere to these guidelines. These are the guidelines for the full year, and we have a few samples of these coming up. But the reason we're throwing in these scenarios, it's important when you sit with your fixture plans that you think of the scenarios yourself that might come up, and what's the answers to them going to be, because it makes it much easier to get your answers then than when they actually happen and it's caught on the spot. So just having to think of potential scenarios for yourself is really important. So we kept mentioning competition guidelines there, and without them, it is essential to ensure your fixtures are played as scheduled. So you need these to make sure they're played as scheduled. They are a gem, and the counties who have used them are the ones who've really turned things around in relation to fixtures and getting buy-in from club, because they knew exactly where they were, and there was no person dictating on what the result of any situation was. It was clearly done by the guidelines. So these are just sample guidelines, but they should be specific to your own county in conjunction with the LGFA official guide and your own bylaws. You can have general guidelines and then specific for each competition, which will show you samples of all these. They help you ensure fixtures take place as planned, and it prevents county board meetings, as we said, being consumed by fixtures. So on competition guidelines, some of the areas that there's fixtures, so the actual games themselves, referees, results, placing, so what determines who comes first, second, third, etc. What things do we need to know in relation to match day, which will include the mentors, which we mentioned a second ago, and regulations in relation to the match day. Now, they're just some of the areas which we'll touch on in a second. But before we do, if you want to throw into the chat there, maybe some guidelines that you might suggest, you can just keep them nice and short, don't worry. But some of the areas of the guidelines you think you need to suggest, and I'm sure a lot of your counties already have guidelines, so just throw them into the chat there, and Paul will feed back on them as to what some of these. And Paul, I'm sure while you're waiting, you can stress as well some of the counties you've worked with and the importance of the guidelines.
Yeah, and actually, I suppose one of those things, Lynn, just while people are typing in there, the other thing that the guidelines and having strict fixture guidelines in place has helped in relation to CODA matters as well, on the whole area of CODA, because clubs were appealing fixture decisions or the outcome of league tables and how points were awarded. But when we went back to the counties and they had very clear guidelines that were ratified, and fixture guidelines ratified at the start of the year, it prevented a whole CODA or disciplinary case that may have resulted, or an ongoing appeal. So that also helps from that side of things as well, where people have proper guidelines in place.
Brilliant, yeah.
Nobody has typed anything for you yet, Lynn. They're hoping
There's no
you're going to do
guideline.
all the work for them tonight. So they are. I'd say people are looking to rent you out to be doing their fixture plan for them at the guidelines you've been given and the advice you've been given to them.
What I can do, I can move on and show you some of our guidelines, but if anything pops in there, Paula, feel free to stop me. Because as I said, these are only sample ones, and I know some counties have some excellent ones too. So
okay, hang on, there's just one come in there now. So one guideline that a county has is about a wedding, that a club must let them know 3 months in advance, and then the game goes ahead as planned.
brilliant.
So I suppose weddings is one of the big things that can halt a whole community.
That's it, and that's a great one, because it's fair on the club themselves that they know they're going to have a free weekend or they're not, they can enjoy it. It's also fair on the other club they're playing, but it's fair on you as a county board, because you put a massive time into planning it. So that's really good.
Yeah, another guideline they have is have a guideline in terms of moving a game within a 3-day rule.
Brilliant. So 3 days either side. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah. And there's another one, a match can only be cancelled due to a pitch is unplayable or bereavement closely in a club. 5-day rule if a match is cancelled due to the above, and a new date must be given by 5 days of original fixture.
Yeah, so it's very clear for the clubs.
Yeah, another example is games to be played on or before a certain date rather than a set date. This gives a little leeway to clubs to organise the game, and I know we kind of would do that. It can be moved before the date and played, has to be played before the date, or if not, they play on the date agreed.
Brilliant.
And then the last one was fixtures should not deal with managers' requests, stick to secretary of clubs. So all official correspondence coming through, and absolutely 100% agree with that one.
And on that one too, Paula, the importance for counties that you're only dealing with emails to come through the official LGFA email address, because that is the official email address. So I think that's really important on that one too, Paula.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And a reason why we got everyone their official email address, so that you know exactly who you're dealing with. But also those emails should be signed off by someone, not just signed off by the club name and secretary. The name of the person should be on those emails as well. Another one that has come in, Lynn, is if the game is cancelled in round 1, it has to be played before round 3. Somebody else has, if the field's unplayable, then the home club must find the field, otherwise then the fixture is reversed.
Yeah, very good. So at least it stops a backlog of fixtures for certain counties. So as I said, we'll give you some sample ones here, but also, do you know what, don't ever be afraid to chat to each other, especially if you're like counties. What I mean by that is kind of around the same numbers and stuff, because a lot of your guidelines might help each other. Is really important as well. So some of the guidelines, these are just samples, as we said, and we can send these out afterwards to everyone that's registered anyway, there's no issue. But for instance, fixtures, some of the things that might entail, there could be sections. So the sample one we have has all these sections, and these are on the website as well. Changing the date of a fixture might be a section. Failing to fulfill a fixture, failing to fulfill multiple fixtures, postponing matches, player eligibility, county teams, exceptional circumstances. So samples of some of these, and pitch availability, as somebody mentioned. So for instance, changing the date of a fixture, and I'm not going to read through all the wording on you, I'll have you reading a bedtime story. But changing the date of a fixture, for this to be permitted, both teams must agree on an alternative date before seeking permission. So I think that was mentioned there a few minutes ago. And also that no games can be moved or changed without the permission of the relevant coordinator. So you can see there, though, the second part tells you what happens if that does happen, which is the important part of the guidelines. So if they did go and change unknown to it, what happens to them? But that's what we mean by it doesn't have to come to a full county board meeting for a full discussion and all clubs voting on it. It is clearly there what happens if they need to do it and what happens if they breach it is very clearly there. And that's where the guidelines are important. Another sample, the postponing matches, and I know somebody mentioned there in relation to bereavement, and this is where it's important to be clear as well. So if you look at a sample here, matches can only be cancelled at short notice in the event of a bereavement of a close family member of a player, mentor or club official, or a serious tragedy in the parish, and provided the fixtures committee and opposing team have been informed. A close family member is defined as a parent, child, sibling or grandparent. Cousins are only included in tragic circumstances. Now you might say that's very detailed, but we've all been there where there's been a second cousin and a third cousin and a great grandaunt and everything else for getting games cancelled. So at least by having it very clearly defined what a close family member is, it makes it a lot easier for yourselves in relation to deciding on that fixture being postponed or not. For referees, and all the headings that I gave you in the previous fixtures, there's a section in the sample for all of those. I'm only giving you, as I said, I don't want to bore you with the wording of them all. We're just giving you a flavour of them in these few slides. For referees, it could be sections like who appoints them. So for what age grades are referees appointed by the fixtures committee versus the club appointing them. How contact will be made with referees, the behaviour in relation to them, and then the referees' expenses. So clearly having there how much it is to pay referees for each game and how they'll be paid. And again, that'll differ from county to county, and in relation to your team sheet. So making this very specific to your county and how it's going to be dealt with. For results, how are they going to come in? So if the referee is appointed by the fixtures committee, if you use a games management system, so it could be the GAA games management system, where its text results come straight back in, then that it's clearly in here as to how it is. And more counties, in fairness, are creating websites, and that's where fixtures are becoming more and more important. And particularly these automated ones, where after a game, a referee can get a text and say, send in the result of St. Patrick's versus St. Mary's, and they'll actually put in the result and it automatically updates the website. So it depends, but if that's not the case, maybe it's that they have to text back a certain number. Whatever it is, you put it in here. If the referee is not appointed by the fixtures committee, then what happens? So in this case, the responsibility of the home club to ensure they send the text results back, whether it be to the system or to the relevant coordinator, whatever it is for your county. So at least everyone knows at the start of the year, this is how we're going to deal with results. For decisions on placings, and this is extremely important to think about this early in the year as to how things are going to happen. When two teams, in the event of a tie, what's going to happen? And the reason this is important, and I do agree, a lot of clubs don't read this properly until it happens to them, and then they're like, what do you mean it's been decided on X, Y, or Z? But it has been in it from the start of the year, so at least this is, they clearly know how it's going to be. This is what's going to happen. So if two teams tie, the result of the game between the two teams. If it's drawn, it's points scored to decide. So whatever you decide for your competitions is clearly in there, so that they can see what happens in the event of a tie, whether it's in a game or on tables. But it's done at the start of the year, and your clubs have agreed on these. So there's no argument. This is all done before a ball is thrown in. The timing and days of games. So particularly if you're a dual county, and I've seen a number of counties who have a lot of camogie and football actually sitting with the county board from camogie and picking out the days, the times, so that they aren't clashing. So this is just an example of, okay, all your under 8 games are going to be at 11 on Sundays. So this could all be in the competition guidelines. And you'll see in a second the ability there to have to change it, as you said, to within 2 or 3 days. But at least it's the club asking for that request in relation to it. But this just really helps you in relation to, okay, we've got used to all our age games are at this time, at this date, at this day, and this is when they're going to happen. And it does help as well for players who maybe have part-time jobs, etc., that they know, listen, we're always playing on a Saturday evening or whatever. So that's just an example. It doesn't always, not always possible, but it's an example in the competition guidelines. For match day then, what's the numbers that's allowed? So obviously we said you have to take in the official guide into this, so the maximum you are going to have is the 30, but maybe there's 7-a-side leagues or 9-a-side that you're going to have to alter this for yourself. For the sideline, who's allowed on it? And this, what we're saying, is important for that scenario we showed you a second ago. Your managers permitted along the sideline, and the mayor foreigner may enter the field of play only during a break and play. But it is important that if that's the guideline, well then it's adhered to, that it doesn't come to a final and next there's uproar. Well, sure, I was allowed to do that for all the other games. And I know you can't be at every game, But at least if the clubs know this is what it was, well, they would try and adhere to it then for the year coming up. And it adds that little bit of professionalism to your games as well. But what's your guidelines that you want? So your guidelines really are setting the standards you want to have as a county board. Competition regulations, and I know this is really small, and again, the reason being it's going to completely depend on your county and they're in the samples, but this could be setting out a particular competition. What's the number of players in that competition? So in this, maybe we're looking at the whole of the adult competition. We're going to say that there's championship, there's league, and there's also non-county players. So what's the number of players in each? How many subs are allowed in each? What happens if there's walkovers? For the cup competition, what's the rules? For the championship, what's the rules? And for the league, what's the rules? So if I'm now over at the senior team in my club, actually on this one page pretty much is everything I need to know for my team going forward, and what's the difference between the rules of different competitions. For instance, with cup, I'm allowed to go down to 13 a side. Maybe that's not the case with other competitions. So what's the different regulations for each age grade? So you have this for all your grades, all your adult, under 18, under 16, and then for each competition within that, just to give real clarity at the start of the year. So what does that result in? Well, hopefully, as I said, there is going to be little tweaks and changes. We said that change in weather, we do live in Ireland after all, but the results, what you'd hope to have is clear competition guidelines and a fixture plan. That's in your hands. So that's something you can do. Nobody can affect that. You can do that. But by having those, you should have a smoother running of fixtures. It should enable your fixture committee to fulfill their role. They are given terms of reference to fulfill the role. Let them do it, because now when they have those guidelines, all those little discussions and little tiny decisions don't need to be drawn to every county board meeting. They're decided by the fixtures committee. So the county board meetings are not consumed by fixtures. And the biggest thing in all of this, which is the players in the middle of it, there's more games played. And I know from working with loads of county boards, you love being at games, and I think this year, if nothing else, has proven how much we miss our games and being at them. So more games played is so, so important. And when you're asking yourself, perhaps at the start of the year when you have your plan, or at the end of the year, all players are looking for is, are they getting real value out of being involved in their club? So are they getting enough games? And I was at a brilliant talk last year, and they were saying you don't often hear about the price of getting involved in something if people feel they're getting the value. And what they meant by that, and they were talking about a different sport where they were talking about the price of membership in it, but that they wouldn't hear from parents or anyone else if they were like, geez, they're getting great value. And even when you're selling it to your clubs, instead of saying, well, the cost to play football with the under 14s this year in your club is going to be this, you'd actually say, well, if you want to be involved with the under 14s in your club, you're going to get 16 games, you're going to get all your training sessions, everything else, all for this price, all for this value. So all for whatever amount of money it is. There's a big difference in how you sell it on the value that they're getting for something versus seeing it as a price. And I think players across all our codes, due to the work that's been done by our county boards and the amount of fixtures that they're providing for them, they're getting unbelievable value when you look at the money they're spending on other activities, but they're not getting the same amount of value. So we really need to make sure we're selling the value that we're giving people, and that's down to the hard work and the planning that you're all putting in at county board level. So before we wrap up, because I know there was a lot of stuff there, and we have recorded this, we will have it available for you to watch back, but more important, we'll send you the sample guidelines, etc. But it's just to see if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in there. What we're trying to stress is that the more planning you can get done in advance in relation to, okay, when your fixture going to be, but those competition guidelines we cannot stress enough, both for getting games played, and as Paula said, the adverse effects of disciplinary and code and everything else. It's really tightening up the whole thing, that it makes it much easier for you to fulfill your role as a county board and a fixtures committee. Paul, I don't know if you have anything you want to come in on that also.
Yeah, we can just wait to see. You have no questions or comments there at the minute, Lynn. But yeah, and I think, as Lynn said, it may feel like an awful lot thrown at you, or there's a lot there in those grids, but definitely when you actually sit down to plan out your fixtures, and if you have that information there beside you, first of all, Lynn's already explained the structure of how you could sit, where the starting point is, and a lot of things is working back. And then it's making sure, where is the overlap? Can we move something? Where have we regular room, I suppose, to move things? And I suppose, like everything, there's no one key recipe for a perfect fixture plan. It is about playing around with it and maybe coming up with something that works for you and for your county. But that may need tweaking every now and again, depending on, I suppose, as you said, Lynn, dual players, or if the master fixture plan changes, or whatever that is, to adjust it, but not to be afraid to. Some questions coming into you now, Lynn. Is it possible to get the set of slides? Was it difficult to keep up? Absolutely. And there is, the full guidelines are all on the website, Lynn, aren't they?
Yeah, the full guidelines on the website. And what we'll do is Claire will be sending out an email to you tomorrow, and we'll make sure she attaches the sample ones anyway, just so that you all have them.
Okay. People are asking about what's been done to reduce the amount of county fixtures so that more club games can take place. And that's something that was a big discussion at our last Central Council meeting, about the club window, which obviously a lot of counties and clubs got this year because of COVID, but it is something that's being considered in the new plan. But unfortunately, Lynn doesn't have that magic wand to be able to answer that one just tonight for you all. Can each county board have their own competition rules?
100%, yeah. The ones we send you are literally a sample, because a lot of counties went, where do we start? So they're just a sample, and you make it then to fit your county.
Perfect. And someone saying the webinar was great assistance, and thanks very much. And yeah, and I suppose, Lynn, going by other counties who have attended similar webinars like this before, they have fed back to us that when they did sit down and use the guidelines, it's been extremely helpful to them from a practical point of view too, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been really helpful from a practical, especially just to make it, I suppose sometimes, and we would have been guilty of it ourselves, you jump straight into throwing everything on the calendar without actually knowing how much do I need to fit into it. So putting that initial steps around the number of rounds you're going to need and the types of competitions, at least you know, okay, it's like the ingredients. Okay, here's all the stuff we have now. Where are we going to fit it in to make the apple pie? So it's making sure that you know all this stuff before you actually move on to the next step of putting it actually in the calendar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Lynn touched on it in the value and the price. And I suppose that we all remember, players join our game to play, not to train. So if they're spending more majority training than they are having opportunity to play games, then we're definitely not doing something right. So it's another one to consider when you're doing that weighing scales of the value that we're providing for players.